The Day the Sky Fell, the untold story of the Johnstown flood of 1889. They said the dam would hold. For years, the wealthy men who vacationed beside Lake Conemaugh insisted that the old earthen wall above the valley was safe. Engineers had expressed concerns, locals had whispered fears, but the South Fork Dam had stood for decades, and on the morning of May 31, 1889, it still stood, quiet, heavy, and swollen with days of relentless rain. Below it, in the hard-working steel town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 20,000 people went about their day, unaware that within hours their city would be erased. This is the true story of one of the deadliest disasters in American history, the catastrophe that killed more than 2,200 people and changed the way America thought about wealth, responsibility, and disaster relief forever. The Valley of Iron and Fire. In the late 19th century, Johnstown was a symbol of American industrial ambition. Nestled in a narrow valley where the Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers met, the town had grown rapidly alongside the booming steel industry. The Cambria Iron Company employed thousands, producing rails that stitched together the expanding United States. Immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Wales, and Eastern Europe flooded into the valley. Houses climbed the hillsides, churches rose beside factories. Railroad tracks threaded through neighborhoods like metal veins. But Johnstown had one problem: water. The valley floor was flat and low. Flooding was not unusual. The rivers regularly swelled after heavy rain. Residents were used to muddy streets and basement floods. What they were not prepared for was a man-made lake perched 450 feet above them. A playground for America's elite. High in the Allegheny Mountains sat Lake Conemaugh, created decades earlier by a canal system. After the canal fell out of use, the reservoir and its dam were sold. In 1881, a group of wealthy industrialists purchased the property and formed the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Among its members were some of the richest men in America: Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick. They transformed the rustic area into an exclusive retreat. Cottages lined the lake. A grand clubhouse hosted lavish dinners. Guests arrived by private rail cars. But modifications were made to the dam. To create a carriage road across the top, the dam was lowered slightly. Fish screens were installed in the spillway to keep prized fish from escaping, screens that could trap debris. Maintenance was inconsistent. Repairs were patched rather than engineered. Some engineers warned the structure was vulnerable. Their concerns went largely ignored. The rain that would not stop. In late May 1889, a powerful storm system stalled over western Pennsylvania. Rain fell for days. Streams turned into torrents. Roads washed out. Telegraph lines failed. By May 30th, Lake Conemaugh was dangerously high. Water lapped at the crest of the South Fork Dam. Club members and workers attempted emergency measures, digging channels, clearing debris, but the rain kept falling. Below, in Johnstown, residents watched the rivers rise, but assumed it would be another routine flood. They were wrong. 3:10 p.m. On May 31, 1889, sometime shortly after 3 p.m., the South Fork Dam gave way. An estimated 20 million tons of water burst free. Witnesses described a thunderous roar, like continuous cannon fire. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Entire hillsides were torn apart as the wall... When the water finally stopped moving, there was no silence. There was screaming. There was the sound of splintered wood collapsing in slow aftershocks. There was the crackle of fire from the wreckage jam at the Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge. There was the low animal moan of a town that no longer recognized itself.
Johnstown had not merely flooded, it had been rearranged. The Stone Bridge Inferno. The massive debris field that slammed into the railroad bridge became a floating island of destruction nearly 30 feet high. Hundreds were trapped inside it, pinned between timbers, tangled in barbed wire, wedged inside crushed homes. Then came the oil. Railcars torn apart upstream had released barrels of petroleum. As wreckage scraped against iron and stone, sparks flew. Flames erupted. For 3 days the pile burned. Survivors later described hearing voices from inside the debris, cries that gradually weakened and disappeared. Rescue crews could not reach them without risking collapse or explosion. The heat was unbearable. The flood had already drowned thousands. The fire claimed more. Searching the mud. When morning broke on June 1st, the scale of devastation became visible. The entire downtown district was gone. Bodies lay in trees, in fields, in twisted metal. Some were buried beneath feet of mud. Others had been carried miles downstream. Families walked in stunned silence, lifting boards, calling names. Identification became nearly impossible. Many victims had no documents. Clothing had been stripped away by the force of water. Children were separated from parents forever. Eventually, a temporary morgue was established. More than 700 unidentified victims were buried in a single section of Grandview Cemetery. To this day, it remains one of the largest mass graves in U.S. history. A national shockwave. News of the disaster spread quickly despite damaged telegraph lines. Newspapers from New York City to Chicago ran banner headlines. Illustrated sketches captured the horror in haunting detail. Americans were stunned. This was the Gilded Age, the era of booming industry, railroad expansion, and rising fortunes. Disasters were not new, but the scale of Johnstown felt biblical. And it struck at a time when wealth disparity was becoming impossible to ignore. The same industrial revolution that had built Johnstown had also built the lake above it. Clara Barton arrived. Within days, a 67-year-old woman stepped off a train into the ruins. Clara Barton had founded the American Red Cross just 8 years earlier. Johnstown would become its defining moment. She brought doctors, nurses, food, tents, and organization. For 5 months, the Red Cross operated relief centers in the valley, its first major peacetime disaster response. Temporary shelters were built, clothing distributed, funds managed. Barton's leadership transformed public perception of disaster relief in America. Before Johnstown, large-scale coordinated aid was rare. After Johnstown, it became expected. The survivor's guilt. Not everyone who lived felt fortunate. Many suffered what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Men who failed to save their families.
The Day the Sky Fell. Part 3. Power, Blame, and the Birth of Modern Accountability. The water had receded. The funerals had ended. But the anger was just beginning. In the smoking ruins of Johnstown, survivors did not speak first about nature. They spoke about men. The Club on the Mountain. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had been more than a leisure retreat. It was a symbol of America's new aristocracy, industrial titans whose fortunes were measured not in thousands, but in millions. Members included railroad magnates, steel barons, bankers. At the center of public suspicion stood men like Andrew Carnegie, whose steel empire shaped the nation's infrastructure, and Henry Clay Frick, a ruthless industrial strategist known for crushing labor resistance. Though neither man was present at the dam the day it failed, they were part of the club that owned it. and ownership, survivors argued, meant responsibility. The legal wall. Nearly 80 lawsuits were filed against the club. Families who had lost children, business owners ruined overnight, workers permanently injured. But the legal system of 1889 was not designed for corporate accountability on this scale. Under prevailing tort law, plaintiffs had to prove direct negligence by identifiable individuals. It was not enough to show the dam had failed. It was not enough to show alterations had been made. They had to prove exactly who made which decision and that it directly caused the collapse. That standard proved impossible. The defense argued the rainfall was unprecedented, the storm extraordinary, the collapse unavoidable. The court agreed. The flood was ruled an act of God. No damages were awarded. No executive paid a cent. To many Americans, the verdict felt like a second disaster. Public opinion turns. Newspapers across the country criticized the ruling. Editorials questioned whether wealth placed men above the law. Political reformers pointed to Johnstown as evidence that industrial power had outgrown legal safeguards. The Gilded Age, an era of glittering fortunes and crushing inequality, was beginning to crack under scrutiny. While the club dissolved quietly, its members continued their careers. Andrew Carnegie would go on to become one of history's most famous philanthropists, funding libraries and universities across America. Henry Clay Frick would later face national controversy during the Homestead Strike of 1892. But for many in Pennsylvania, the shadow of Johnstown never left them. The rise of strict liability. Though the lawsuits failed, the Johnstown flood influenced American law in subtler ways. Law scholars began debating the doctrine of strict liability, the idea that certain activities are so inherently dangerous that responsibility should not depend solely on proving negligence. Over time, courts gradually expanded protections for victims of industrial accidents. Johnstown became a case study in law schools. The tragedy helped reshape conversations about risk, infrastructure, and accountability. Its impact was slow but real. Diaries from the ruins. In the months after the flood, letters and diaries.
The Day the Sky Fell, Part 4, The Final Hours Minute by Minute. Morning broke on May 31, 1889, under a sky the color of iron. Rain had already been falling for nearly 24 hours. In the mountains above Johnstown, the soil was saturated, the streams swollen, the lake rising inch by inch against the aging wall of earth known as the South Fork Dam. At the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, anxiety replaced leisure. Caretakers walked the Crim's Crest before sunrise. Water was only inches from overtopping. They began digging. 8 a.m., the first alarm. By 8 a.m., Lake Conemaugh had risen dangerously high. Workers attempted to clear the spillway, which had been partially obstructed by debris and fish screens installed years earlier to protect the club's prized bass. Some tried to deepen the emergency channel by hand. Shovels against saturated earth. Mud collapsing back into itself. Every minute mattered. Down in Johnstown, residents noticed rising river levels, but floods were common. Many believed the worst would pass. Telegraph lines had already failed in places due to the storm. Communication was breaking down. 11 a.m. Panic on the dam. The water began to spill over the top of the dam in thin sheets. Overtopping was catastrophic for earthen dams. Once water began flowing over the crest, erosion accelerated rapidly. Men attempted to pile rocks and mud to raise the height. It was too late. Some accounts suggest a messenger rode on horseback to warn towns below, but conflicting reports and damaged lines meant warnings were fragmented at best. In Johnstown, no formal evacuation occurred. 1 p.m., the structure weakens. Observers reported visible sagging in portions of the dam. Small leaks became streams. The earthen core, weakened by years of inadequate maintenance, began to erode internally. Modern engineers later concluded that the spillway capacity was insufficient for the volume of rainfall. Even without modifications, the storm would have severely tested the structure, but the lowered crest and blocked drainage reduced its resilience. The lake continued to rise. 2:50 p.m., the final minutes. Witnesses described a deep rumble. Then a section near the center began to slump. What happens when 20 million tons of water find a weakness? They do not trickle. They tear. 3:10 p.m., collapse. The South Fork Dam gave way. The breach widened rapidly, dozens of feet in seconds. A wall of water exploded through the gap, instantly accelerating downhill, gathering trees, soil, and structures into its path. Entire hillsides were shaved clean. The lake disappeared in less than an hour. Above the valley, there was suddenly silence where water had been. Below it, thunder. The waves' descent. The flood did not move like ordinary water. It behaved like a moving mountain. At South Fork Town, the first community below the dam, residents saw a dark wall filling the valley horizon. Some ran. Most had no time. Buildings disintegrated. Railroad cars were lifted and thrown.
The house on Vine Street. The rain had been falling for 2 days when Daniel O'Rourke decided not to go to work. He stood at the window of their small wooden home on Vine Street in Johnstown, watching the Conemaugh River crawl higher against its banks. The mills were already slowing. Smoke hung low in the wet air. The streets were thick with mud. His wife, Margaret, moved quietly behind him, drying dishes. "Another flood," she said. "We've seen worse." They had not. Their children, Annie, age 9, and Thomas, age 6, were building towers from scrap wood near the stove. Outside, neighbors walked briskly through the rain, boots splashing. The rivers rose every spring. Johnstown always endured. 2:45 p.m. The first sign was not water. It was sound. A deep vibration rolled through the valley, so low it felt more than heard. Daniel paused. "Did you feel that?" Margaret shook her head. Then came shouting from down the street. Someone was running. 3:30 p.m. Daniel stepped outside just in time to see it. At the far end of the valley, where the hills narrowed, something black filled the horizon. Not like a river, not like rain, like a moving cliff. The sound intensified, a roar like 1,000 locomotives. People screamed. "Run!" someone shouted. "The dam broke!" The dam. Most residents barely thought about it. The South Fork Dam sat miles away, holding back a private lake owned by wealthy club members, men like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. It had always been there, until now. The first impact. Daniel burst through the front door. "Upstairs, now!" Margaret grabbed Thomas. Annie dropped her wooden tower. The roar became deafening. Before they reached the staircase, the front wall exploded inward. Water and debris crashed into the house with violent force. Daniel felt himself lifted, not by hands, but by liquid weight. The house shifted from its foundation. Boards snapped like twigs. Margaret screamed. Inside the current.
The O'Rourke home did not immediately collapse. It floated. Entire houses often did in the flood, riding the surge like fragile boats. Daniel found himself pinned against the staircase railing, water up to his chest. He saw Annie clinging to the banister above. "Hold on!" he shouted. Then the house struck something. A jolt. The structure split. Daniel lost sight of Margaret. Margaret's moment. Thrown into the current, Margaret instinctively grabbed the first thing she touched, a floating door ripped from another home. Thomas slipped from her grasp. The water was not clear. It was black, thick with mud, timber, iron, animals, and pieces of people's lives. She screamed his name.
The Gilded Age cracks. By the summer of 1889, the floodwaters had dried, but something else had begun to rise. Suspicion. The Johnstown flood did not occur in isolation. It happened at the height of America's Gilded Age, a time of explosive industrial growth, railroad expansion, and staggering private wealth. Fortunes were being built faster than laws could regulate them, and Johnstown exposed the gap. The industrial titans under scrutiny. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club quietly dissolved after the disaster. Its membership roster read like a directory of American power. Among them, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick. Though neither man was physically present at the dam that day, their association with the club made them symbolic figures in the public debate. Newspapers asked uncomfortable questions. If private wealth could build lakes in the mountains, who ensured those lakes were safe? If industrial magnates could alter dams without strict oversight, who protected the towns below? The court ruling labeled the collapse an act of God. But for many Americans, the phrase sounded like legal shelter for power. The quiet shift in American law. The lawsuits failed, but the legal conversation changed. The Johnstown flood became one of the most studied negligence cases in U.S. history. Over time, American courts increasingly embraced doctrines like expanded liability for hazardous activities, greater corporate accountability, recognition of duty of care in infrastructure management. While the flood did not instantly reform the system, it contributed to the broader legal evolution that would define the progressive era. By the early 1900s, calls for regulation of railroads, food safety, and industrial practices were growing louder. Johnstown was frequently cited as evidence that self-regulation by elites was not enough. Disaster relief became national. One of the clearest transformations came through relief efforts. When Clara Barton arrived in Pennsylvania, the American Red Cross was still relatively new. Johnstown became its proving ground. For 5 months, relief tents housed survivors. Funds were distributed with organized oversight. Medical care was centralized. It was one of the first large-scale coordinated disaster responses in U.S. peacetime history. After Johnstown, Americans expect the floodwaters of 1889 receded within days. The grief did not. Children who survived grew up in the shadow of absence. In Johnstown, family trees carried gaps, blank branches where names should have been. Weddings were quieter, holidays smaller. Entire bloodlines ended in a single afternoon. History books would record 2,209 deaths. Johnstown remembered faces. A town marked by water. The rebuilt city did not forget what happened above it. When it flooded again in 1936, older residents stood in their doorways watching the rivers rise with a look younger generations did not yet understand. In 1977, when another catastrophic flood struck, reporters interviewed elderly survivors of 1889, men and women in their 90s, who said the sound was the same, like thunder that doesn't stop. 3 generations,
3 floods, 1 valley. The dam becomes memory. Today, the remnants of the South Fork Dam sit quietly within the Johnstown Flood Memorial. There is no towering structure left, just a wide grassy break in an earthen ridge. Visitors stand at the breach and look down the long, narrow valley. It is difficult to imagine 20 million tons of water racing through that space. But the earth remembers. So do the archives. So do the graves. The Gilded Age reconsidered. In the decades after the flood, America changed. Reform movements gained momentum. Public demand for regulation intensified. Journalists, soon called muckrakers, began exposing unsafe practices in industry and government. The flood did not single-handedly create reform, but it became part of a pattern. It symbolized the cost of unchecked industrial confidence. Men like Andrew Carnegie later reshaped their public legacy through philanthropy. Libraries, universities, and cultural institutions bore his name. Yet in Pennsylvania, older families remembered something else: a lake above a town, a dam lowered for convenience, a spillway blocked by fish screens. The debate was never just about rain. It was about responsibility. The science of what went wrong. Modern engineers have reconstructed. In the spring of 1889, no one in Johnstown believed they were living beneath a ticking clock. The dam had stood for decades. The lake above it looked peaceful. The men who owned it were powerful, respected, admired. Progress was visible everywhere. Railroads, steel mills, electric lights beginning to glow in American cities. It felt like the future. Then the future collapsed in less than an hour. A pattern repeated in history. The Johnstown flood was not the last time America would witness catastrophe where human decisions magnified natural forces. History would repeat the pattern. Infrastructure assumed safe, warnings minimized, maintenance deferred, disaster declared unexpected. Over a century later, investigations into modern dam failures, levee collapses, and industrial disasters often reveal familiar themes: complacency, underinvestment, fragmented oversight. Johnstown was not an anomaly. It was a preview. The scale of risk today. The United States now maintains tens of thousands of dams. Many were built in the early to mid-20th century. Many are aging. Extreme rainfall events are increasing in frequency and intensity in various regions. The combination is uncomfortable because Johnstown teaches something critical. Disaster is rarely a single failure. It is accumulated risk, layer upon layer, until one storm pushes it past the threshold. Memory as infrastructure. Today, the quiet remains of the breached dam are preserved within the Johnstown Flood National Memorial. School children visit. Tourists walk the grassy ridge. Interpretive signs explain engineering flaws and historical context. But memory itself functions like infrastructure. It must be maintained. If forgotten, the same vulnerabilities return. The human legacy. 2,209 people died. 396 were children. Those numbers are. In the early evening of May 31, 1889, the valley of Johnstown looked like the aftermath of war. Where streets had stood, there was mud. Where homes had stood, there was absence. Where laughter had filled kitchens hours earlier, there was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet, the kind that follows something irreversible. Night falls on ruin. As darkness settled, survivors lit lanterns and small fires on higher ground. They searched, they called names into the dark. Some listened for answers that would never come. The stone bridge still smoldered. Smoke drifted through the valley like a second fog. The river carried fragments of lives downstream, furniture, photographs, doors, children's toys. Entire histories dissolved into current. The weight of mourning. When dawn broke on June 1st, the full scale of destruction revealed itself. 1,600 homes gone, thousands displaced, more than 2,200 dead, nearly 400 of them children. Rows of bodies were laid out for identification. Many could not be named. Some were buried in a mass grave that still exists today, a solemn reminder that not every story receives closure. And yet, amid the devastation, people moved. They lifted beams, they cleared streets, they built shelters. Grief did not stop labor. A nation watches. News spread quickly despite damaged telegraph lines. Illustrated newspapers in cities like New York and Chicago published detailed sketches of the destruction. America watched in disbelief. For many, it was the first time they confronted the consequences of industrial expansion colliding with nature. The dam above Johnstown had been owned by members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, powerful industrialists, including figures such as Andrew Carnegie. When courts later ruled the flood an act of God, public reaction was mixed. Some accepted the ruling. Others questioned whether the phrase shielded wealth from accountability. The debate did not fade. It evolved. What remains? There are no more sirens, no more roaring water, no more flames at the stone bridge, only a valley that learned the cost of assumption. The Johnstown flood was not the deadliest disaster in American history. It was not the last, but it was one of the first to expose a new reality of the modern age. When industry expands faster than oversight, when infrastructure ages without vigilance, when power concentrates without accountability, risk accumulates quietly, and then, suddenly, it does not. On May 31, 1889, 20 million tons of water were released in under an hour. 2,209 lives were lost. 396 children never grew up. 99 families vanished entirely. The storm was fierce, but storms are not rare. What made the disaster catastrophic was vulnerability layered over time, lower dam height, insufficient spillway capacity, inconsistent maintenance, misplaced confidence. The rain was natural. The consequences were amplified. The courts ruled it an act of God. History has been less certain. Legal scholars still examine the case. Engineers